So what I want to present to you is a theory of injunctive norms. So we just discussed at lunch. Injunctive means that it's something global, which is not like descriptive. Okay, I mean, I don't have to explain this to you. But in order to, like, for you to understand what exactly I'm doing and why, I have to give you a little overview of the development of behavioral economics in the last 20 or 30 years. So just for those who don't know, experimental economic studies, I mean, it doesn't only study social, it also studies individual behavior, but for us, mostly interesting in social decisions related to some kind of allocation of money. And what I will talk about is how to model what norms should emerge given some specific types of allocations that are available. So this, of course, is not a new question in experimental economics, and many people, you know, worked a lot on this. So let me give you a simple example. So you can choose between $1 and $5 or $2 and $7 for two other people. So you are not involved in this. You get like some flat amount of money. And of course, most people choose this. Why? Because it has more money for both people, right? So this is what economists call preference for efficiency, payoff efficiency. Another example is like this. So it's the same 1 and 2 that one person gets, but another person gets 50 or 45. So notice that now this, so here this payoff, sum of payoffs was bigger than here, so it was more efficient. Here this is not true because the sum of this is less than that. But still many people choose that, and that's what economists call preferences for maximin. So you try to maximize the minimal amount that someone gets. Then in the Dictator Game, I'm sorry, I put the descriptions even though everyone knows what Dictator Game is. I thought in case, because Sergey sent this message that we should prepare for general. So, okay, but what's important here is a randomly chosen dictator, so this is crucial, who has $10 given to him by an experimenter. So it's a windfall money. Is asked to divide it between two people, right? Herself and someone else. So what happens here is many people give half, many people give nothing, some give something in between. So this is explained in standard, let's say, behavioral economics by inequity aversion and selfishness. So some people like inequity aversion, they give you half. Some are just selfish, so they give you nothing. So ultimatum game, which is the same only with possibility of rejection, as you all know, what happens here is that people give something in between 20 and 50. People reject usually stuff below 30%. This is weird students, right? So this is not. So this is usually explained by inequity aversion. So even the rejection can be in principle explained by inequity aversion. If you really dislike inequity, you will choose 0, 0 over any amount because it's more equal. Or it can be explained by punishment, which I will come back to. Then there are other more complicated cases that people study like this. For example, this is a famous game by McCabe, Brigden, and Smith. So what you see here is that when player 2 chooses in this row, so 25 for player 1, and so here 15 for player 1, 30 for player 2. This is the distribution of choices, but if you remove the move of player 1, then distributions of choices change to this. And this is usually explained by reciprocity, which means that when player 1 does this, he, allows player 2 to essentially give him less payoff than 20, which he didn't choose. So it means that player 2 sort of feels reciprocal and chooses 25, 25. But here, since there is no reciprocity needed, since there is no move of player 1, people act more selfishly and get a 30 more often. Of course, this contradicts the outcome-based theory of inequity aversion, because inequity aversion is just based on outcomes that you get, right? So this change in behavior you cannot explain by any outcome-based preferences. So then there are other experiments, for example, this one where you can choose how to punish people after they give you different amounts in the Dictator Game. And what you find is that second parties, these are people who actually receive the money, or third parties who just observe this thing, both punish people who give them less than half. So this is explained by negative reciprocity or altruistic punishment, which according to, it was Ferengachter, I think, They put it that altruistic punishment means that people just want to, maintain some kind of social norm. I mean, I'm not a big fan of this term, but yeah, this is just as an example. So third-party punishment in particular is inconsistent with reciprocity theories that are popular in economics because third parties don't lose anything or don't gain, so they cannot be involved in this reciprocal relationship. So what I'm trying to say is that what behavioral and experimental economics is now is mostly just many disconnected and contradictory theories which explain some behavior in some contexts. But we don't know which context which theory should be applied to. And I mean, this is never discussed much, unfortunately, until now. Well, and also if you do many different experiments, I mean, it looks like behavior very much depends on some irrelevant from the perspective of some theories, these theories that describe to you additional actions or additional frames or whatever that technically shouldn't matter, but they do. So the concept of social norms started being used in experimental economics for, I mean, this is not the only reason, but the reason important to us, at least to me, is that social norms can solve these context problems. So the idea is that norms are context dependent, people follow norms, so norms account for context effects in behavior. So we sort of provided some evidence that cooperation in general is norm driven because we have this rule following task, so we show that people who like to follow some random rules also are more cooperative in different dilemmas. And also, so what this led to, the introduction of social norms to behavioral economics, is that there is a method of eliciting norms, so you just incentivize elicitation of how appropriate some actions are in some game. And you essentially can, in principle, elicit norm in any game. So this was kind of for this moment in time, the solution to how to account for context. However, this still does not allow us to, it doesn't constrain us in any way. So we don't know why in one context norms are like this and in another context they're like that. Because we elicit them in each game, but we don't have a theory why they're like this. And this is exactly what we try to do in this paper. So we try to propose a theory which would explain, given any context, what norm should emerge in it. And this should constrain our degrees of freedom so we can create more falsifiable theories about normative behavior in economic games. So to give you so now I will tell you what the theory is. So suppose we have n players and some set of consequences. So consequences are just, essentially, they mean which allocation the set of players get. So each player just gets some payoff in each consequence, right? So you can think of it as just set of allocations of n numbers to n people. Right, so this is just a payoff. So it's important to think of this as personal consumption utility and not utility which includes some other stuff like inequity aversion, let's say. So this is just money or like some stuff that you get and you personally consume. So this is the utility function that Sergey also mentioned before. So his eta is our phi, and he just had like a sum of things. So anyway, I have eta for a norm. So what this means, it means that your utility is just your consumption utility plus this normative term. This is a norm, which is just a mapping of consequences to -1, 1. -1 means very inappropriate, 1 means very appropriate. And phi is just a norm following propensity that you have. Some people, again, exactly as in Sergey's presentation, some people like to follow norms, some people don't. So what we want to do is we try to take these primitives, which is just these utility functions essentially, and try to construct eta from this information. So notice that we do not think, so in our view, or normative values of these outcomes should not depend on the game structure. It only depends on the consequence that is achieved. So no matter how you got there through the game, a consequence will evoke the same feeling of appropriateness or not among people. But I will talk about punishment later, so it's not exactly this. Okay, so how do we do this? We consider dissatisfaction as our basic element of our model of a norm. So what is dissatisfaction? Suppose that you are in consequence C1, And then there is another consequence which gives you more utility than C1. So if this happens, you feel dissatisfied. I mean, we deliberately chose this word because all other words like disappointment, regret are already taken. And we wanted to use a new word because once we use an old word, it immediately starts the whole conversation about how is that related to something else. So it's just like a feeling that you have that you could have had more, but you don't. Okay. So there is a big tradition in philosophy about connecting moral sense to personal emotional feelings about stuff and things that are happening. How much time do I have left? 8 minutes. Really? Okay. Okay, so what we do next, we just aggregate this dissatisfaction over all consequences together, and you get a total dissatisfaction. This is just how much bad you feel about being in consequence C1 because of all other consequences that could have give you more utility, but since you're not there, they didn't. And then we just calculate the overall dissatisfaction. This is just the sum of dissatisfactions of all people together. So what we essentially claim is that the norm is just the negative of this function. So the less dissatisfaction the group gets together, the more socially appropriate it should be. So, and following the same ideas of the same philosophers I just mentioned, they also talk about empathy. So you can think of it as, I feel that this situation is not appropriate because many other people are dissatisfied with it. Right, so what is different between our setting and previous ones is that we do not assume that people care directly about utility of others. We only assume that they care about general dissatisfaction of the whole group, and this is how utility of others enters their utility. So not directly, but through the norm. I will not talk about this. We can discuss this later. Okay, so this norm function has several good properties. So for example, if one consequence Pareto dominates another, its appropriateness is also higher. Most important one, I think, is what it does for the consequences which all have same sum of constant efficiency. So it predicts that essentially a consequence which is in the middle, so think of it as this amount of money to one guy and that amount of money to the other. So sum is always constant, right? So here one guy gets this much and another that much. So it predicts that the consequence that is in the middle of available consequences will have the highest appropriateness. So this is different from, let's say, inequity aversion, which says that the consequence closest to the middle should be the most appropriate. So this means that if some guy has more possibilities to be richer than the other, it will be also more appropriate to do that. So this is a two-player public good game, and this is a trust game. So dark red means higher appropriateness, dark blue means lower appropriateness. So essentially it shows that it's mostly appropriate to cooperate here and to give everything to a second mover in trust game and return a bit more than half. 5? Okay. So we test this model in many different data sets that are known in the literature. So let me skip this. 5 minutes. Okay. So let me give you this example. So this is a free-form bargaining among two people about 3 outcomes. So they should chat online and discuss which outcome they want to choose. So here XX changes from 30 to 80. So this is the data. So this means that the equal outcome is chosen for high X, and here it means that they choose unequal outcome for low X. And essentially, this means that the appropriateness that our model generates for high X cases also predicts that equality should be preferred to efficiency in this case, and here efficiency should be preferred to equality. So essentially, our model predicts this behavior in both treatments that they had. So I think most importantly, though, what our model predicts is give and take behavior in give and take dictator game. So in usual dictator game, you have some money and you can give some to the other participant. In give and take dictator game, you can give to the participant or take from him. And essentially what happens is that in standard dictator game, people give half, many of them. In the give and take, people give nothing. And this essentially is very puzzling because standard models do not explain this at all. So our model of a norm predicts this exact pattern here. So these are just selfish people, so don't forget about that. So our model exactly predicts this behavior, that the most appropriate choice moves to 0 because, as I said before, the most appropriate outcome, if you have constant efficiency, always lies in the middle. And since this is equidistant possibility, so it always lies at 0 here. Okay, so with this case that I already showed you, which is used to be explained by reciprocity, we propose another explanation. So since our norm depends on all consequences that exist in the game, here essentially what happens is that if you play this game without the move of the first player, the appropriatenesses of the two consequences change because of the absence of this one. And this this qualitatively predicts this shift in behavior that we observe in the experiments. So another element of our model that I want to tell you about is punishment. So essentially, once we know what are the appropriateness levels of each consequence, we can develop a punishment mechanism that people might use. So, and this is really simple. It works like this. So if you choose an action which leads everyone away from the most appropriate consequence, it means that you broke a norm. And this means that you should be punished for it. And we essentially just developed this one possible way of how this punishment might work, which works essentially that the amount of punishment should deter you from violation, and how much you violated the norm should correlate with how much you are punished. So it's pretty simple. So just I don't want to go into these details. But I mean, essentially, what norm does is that it says that the person who broke the norm, it's now appropriate to decrease that person's payoff because norm was broken, which creates a new norm. And now we essentially have two norms going in parallel, one for the game that existed before and one which implies that someone should be punished. So this is a ultimatum game. This is when someone accepts the offer. This is the appropriateness of those actions, and this is rejection before you introduce punishment. After you introduce punishment, what you see that for any action which is not half-half, punishing or rejecting becomes more appropriate than actually accepting. And this graph looks very much like Joe's graph with Fiji data when they punish sort of equally on both sides. So in the paper where Fer and Fischbacher extract punishments levels for different levels of giving in Dictator Game, we also predict the pattern that they have. Okay, so what I think would be most interesting to you is that we can easily insert all kinds of real-life things into this model. For example, we can model ownership claims by just changing how much you are dissatisfied. The idea is that you are dissatisfied more by losing money that you own, that you are dissatisfied by losing money that just fell on you from the sky, right, like in experiments. So we also can model social status in group, out group, in relationships by just different weights that you attach to dissatisfactions of others. So for example, if Joe has higher social status than me, then I care more about his dissatisfaction than about my own dissatisfaction, which will lead to all kinds of things like giving more in a Dictator Game to a person with higher status, etc. So the same can be done with kin and with outgroup. So outgroup coefficient can actually be negative, which will mean that I want to maximize the dissatisfaction of the other group, which would sort of lead to hostility. So these are two examples of trust game with two types of ownership. Here, only investor, first mover, owns the amount that he has, and the rest, the money that second mover makes when it triples, is just windfall money. So here the most appropriate thing is that trustee gives back to, so everything is invested and then trustee gives back 1.72 out of 3. So it's more than half. In the other case, when there are two ownerships, that's it? Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay. So anyway, so I mean, you can use all these parameters to model all kinds of interesting things and see how norms change depending on that. So let me skip this and this. So, let me just show this. So in group, out group, this is an experiment also about with a minimal in group, out group paradigm in which people give to own group twice as much than to out group. And essentially what this is like they then run long sequence of 23 very small games, and essentially our model predicts the change in choices that they observe in all of these 23 games pretty well. This is a really short presentation. Okay, anyway, so what we do here is we try to decrease the modular degrees of freedom by providing a theory of how social norms emerge in cases when people exchange money. And essentially, each given context will generate social preference as people observed before in experiments. Depending on what consequences you have, preference will be different. It can be equality, it can be efficiency, it can be something else. And we also show how we can incorporate different types of human universals into this model, which I think can be helpful to model things in. I mean, with students, it's usually not very much because they're all same status. There is no in-group, out-group, but still, I mean, this can be useful. In your work, it might be useful as well, since you work with communities where these kind of things are more important. Finally, I want to talk about this. So the idea that if you have this model in mind, I can easily construct the way how you should optimally learn. So I see, for example, that someone is violating a norm that I think is in place, but is not getting punished for it. What does it mean? It means that that person has some kind of special status, like he has a role entitlement. Oh, this is a high status person. So I can easily foresee how this model can be used to construct a Bayesian model of social learning of norms. And if you're interested, the paper is on my website. Thank you. Okay.
Was there another figure you wanted to go through in the last minute?
Another figure, okay. Let's see. Well, so this is a give-and-take dictator game with two ownerships. So when the dictator and the recipient earn the money that they have to, so dictator can take the money earned by the recipient. So you see that 30% of people here do nothing and 70% here. So this is a treatment without ownership. This is with. And this essentially is very nicely caught by our norm that essentially becomes much less appropriate to take money from someone than in the case when these are windfall money. Yes.
So basically, if I understand it right, I'll need to see the paper. So you're saying that what people are trying to optimize, in a sense, some kind of a relative trade-off, right? Because, well, you're talking about dissatisfaction, but you can take negative and positive, but the thing is that what they compare with is something that is kind of is a characteristic of a particular game. So it's kind of, I'm just trying to find intuition.
Well, so
yeah, maybe you can.
a game is just a set of allocations that all players can receive, right? And dissatisfaction in this given context depends on all other consequences, right, that you can get. So essentially, when you construct this norm, it's dependent on all other consequences that exist, right?
Do you think that your finding changed this interpretation of why the modal response was 0-0 in a dictator game when an option was to take away money? Or did it just reinforce his interpretation?
I'm sorry, I don't.
So you presented the results that John List had a few years ago, where he plays a dictator game, where in addition, where you get a little money, I think me, you get 5, I get 5, and I can take money away from you as well as giving. And then the modal response is, I don't give you anything, because I feel I'm pretty nice not to take money away. That was his interpretation.
Well, yes. I mean, this is like intuition. I mean, essentially here, taking and giving is irrelevant in our model. It's just a dictator game on different interval, essentially, right? So it's like, you see, so for us, so our interpretation is that people play exactly the same dictator game. It's just a matter of, that there is a 0 here or minus, it doesn't matter. John Lee's interpretation might still be correct. We see some evidence of it. But I mean, but he doesn't have a model that predicts that people should do it. He just says it. All right, so I don't know what.
Okay. Do you want to
set up your.
I think you're saying the same thing.
Super fast.
Well, yeah, I'm just doing
Is
it
it a
with
super
math.
fast one or
Yes, yeah. Which for economists is kind of important.
So just a quick question. So does this model or any of these models, is it able to incorporate things like the intentions of players? So, we know that's important. So I know that if you're doing your best, I recognize that and I respond to it. Where does that fit in these kind of models?
When you move in the game and you break a norm, right? This calls for some reaction, like punishment. If you follow the norm, then this can send a signal that you are a good person, that you are a rule follower in general, and then this can lead to other people. I mean, it's not there, but I can easily imagine things like this. If you act according to a norm, right, this sends a signal that you are a rule follower.